The sound is what catches you first. It's not the sound of a payout or a bribe. It's the rhythmic, metallic clink of silver hitting silver, that sharp, heavy sound vibrating against a palm. Now attach that sound to a specific number, 30. In the first century Roman world, 30 pieces of silver? That wasn't a fortune. It was about 120 denarii. Think about that. A denarius was a daily wage for a common laborer. So we're talking about 4 months of steady work. It's a paycheck, not wealth. Under Mosaic law, this was the indemnity payment for a slave accidentally killed by an ox, a legal fine for the loss of property. When you place that specific, disposable price tag on the life of a man rumored to be the Son of God, the arithmetic breaks down. It creates a violent collision between value and betrayal. Was Judas Iscariot driven by simple greed? Or was he a man attempting to force a collision between his own desperate political expectations and a reality he could no longer control? In this episode, we aren't just looking at the money. We're looking at the broken expectations that drove the most infamous act in history. Jerusalem during Passover. It's not a place of comfort. It's a pressure cooker. The air is thick with the smell of roasting lamb, the metallic scent of blood from the temple, and the dust of 100,000 pilgrims. It is a city on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Roman soldiers are everywhere, their armor catching the harsh Judean sun, their eyes scanning the crowds for the slightest sign of sedition. The collective breath of the city is being held. Somewhere in this press of humanity, behind the heavy, cool wooden doors of the high priest's residence, the deal is struck. The atmosphere there is quiet, smelling of damp limestone and unlit oil lamps. That is where the weight of those 30 coins starts to become real, not as abstract history, but as cold, heavy metal resting in a hand, changing the trajectory of an empire. See, we often frame Judas as a cartoon villain, a traitor from the opening credits. But the history, the granular reality, suggests something else. Judas was the treasurer, and to understand the gravity of his betrayal, consider the daily grind of his position. He managed the books. He held the purse strings for a traveling collective that relied entirely on donations. Every day was a calculation of survival. Securing lodging for 13 men in towns bursting at the seams during high festival seasons? That's a logistical nightmare. He negotiated with merchants for bread and dried fish, a constant, haggling struggle to keep costs down while keeping the group fed. He managed the petty bribes required to bypass local gatekeepers or tax collectors who saw a wandering rabbi as a quick mark for extortion. He watched the ledger empty and fill, empty and fill. He felt the anxiety of the dwindling funds when the crowd stopped giving. He heard the same sermons and shared the same meals as the other disciples. He was an insider. That level of proximity makes the act of surrender not just a sin, but a profound, chilling breach of professional trust. He wasn't an outsider looking in. He was the one balancing the budget. Now, the silver itself demands scrutiny. Historical consensus points to these coins being Tyrian shekels. They were the only currency accepted for the temple tax because of their consistent silver purity. They were stamped with the image of the Tyrian god Melkart, which was considered blasphemous by strict Jewish law, but necessary for trade. And here is a layer of irony that is often missed. The priests paid Judas with the very money that was ritually unclean, money they had collected from the people. 30 of these coins was enough to buy a modest plot of land, the potter's field, but it was not enough to retire on. It was a transaction fee. It was the cost of a nuisance. If Judas was a man deep in the messianic weeds, he would have known exactly what that price tag signified: the price of a gored slave, a valuation of nothingness. The priests and the elders were using a script that Judas would have recognized. They set the price low, effectively telling him, "We do not value your leader." He took the money, but the sum was suspiciously, almost insultingly small. Therefore, the motive must be deeper than greed. This leads us to the conflict between two primary theories, the Zealot theory and the Disillusionment theory. The Zealot theory posits that Judas was not a thief, but a revolutionary. He was exhausted by Roman occupation and waiting for the Messiah to stop preaching and start fighting. The Roman Empire was not just a political entity, it was an existential threat. They held the census, they collected the crushing taxes, and they kept the threat of crucifixion for rebellion in plain sight. Judas was waiting for the Messiah to trigger a military uprising. He was trying to force Jesus' hand, hoping the threat of arrest would compel the Messiah to reveal his power and destroy the Roman garrison. He wanted a war, but he gambled on a king who refused to play the game. Then there is the disillusionment theory. This is darker. It suggests Judas realized the kingdom he was following was not a political entity. He saw Jesus entering Jerusalem not on a war horse, but on a donkey. He saw the focus shifting to suffering rather than conquest. If you have sacrificed your life, your profession, and your safety for a revolution that you realize is never coming, the betrayal becomes a cynical act of cutting your losses. The psychological toll of following a leader who refuses to conform to political expectations is heavy. It erodes the follower's sense of reality. Judas was looking for a military savior, and he got a teacher. The dissonance between his internal manifesto and the external reality created a fracture. Hours before, the air was thick with the weight of prayers. Then the silence broke. The metallic clanking returned, muffled by the presence of a detachment of guards. Torches flared, casting erratic shadows against the ancient gnarled olive trees. Out of that encroaching crowd, one man stood out: Judas. He moved with a calculated, chilling precision. He came with a gesture that should have meant intimacy. In the first-century Middle East, the kiss was a formal, sacred act of hospitality and submission. A student kissing a rabbi to show profound honor. It was a seal of solidarity. To take that specific protective sign of kinship, and weaponize it to identify a target in the dark, that is the brutality of the act. He stepped toward his teacher and pressed his lips to that cheek. It was a weapon masquerading as an act of affection. The reaction of the other disciples is rarely discussed with the same weight as the betrayal itself. When news of the betrayal and the subsequent arrest broke, there was no organized resistance from the 11. There was panic. Peter, the man who pledged his life, denied his master. The others scattered. The betrayal did not just break the inner circle, it dismantled it. Judas was not just selling out a leader, he was selling out his own future, his own identity, and his own community. We love to label Judas as a monster because it puts him in a nice, neat box. But when you sit with the details, the narrative frays. If this was really just about money, it was a bad transaction. This betrayal came from the inner circle. It came from someone who walked, ate, and slept beside the person he sold out. Does the motivation change the crime? If Judas was merely greedy, his betrayal is the cold, calculated act of a mercenary. But if he was a man lost in his own misplaced messianic hopes, a man trying to force the world to fit his own design, does that make his actions more tragic or just more deluded? The horror of the act is not found in the greed of the purse, but in the silence that followed the kiss. The betrayal was an attempt to control the outcome of history. The reality was a refusal to be controlled. When we look at the traitor, we are looking at a man who wanted a specific end and was willing to pay any price to force the universe to deliver it. The coins are gone. The garden is quiet. The only thing that remains is the question of what happens when your reality no longer aligns with your belief. Does the chair at the table remain empty, or do you find a way to justify the silver in your hand? The olive trees in Gethsemane are gnarled, ancient things that catch the moonlight in sharp gray slivers, casting shadows that stretch and distort against the stone. In the quiet, the silence is heavy, suffocating, until it is shattered by the distinctive, metallic clink of silver coins. A man steps forward, his face caught in the flickering, erratic orange glow of a torch. He leans in. He offers a kiss, a gesture of intimacy that, in this specific, brutal moment, acts as a signature on a death warrant. For centuries, we have dismissed this as a betrayal born of pure malice or corrosive greed. But honestly, that is a lazy reading of history. If you look at the evidence, a different shape emerges. This was not about selling out a teacher for pocket change. This was the desperate, calculated maneuver of a man who believed he was forcing the hand of a revolutionary who simply refused to fight. Jerusalem during Passover is a high-pressure system. It is a city of dust, stone, and an immense claustrophobic expectation. Every year, thousands of pilgrims flood the gates, and the Roman garrison is fully aware of the danger. The air in Jerusalem during these weeks? It feels heavy enough to bruise. It is a cocktail of roasting lamb, the grit of the Judean desert, and the sharp metallic tang of fear. The Roman soldiers stand on the walls, their armor glinting with a mechanical, cold indifference that mocks the Jewish desire for liberation. In the markets, men whisper about freedom, about the Messiah who will finally break the yoke of Caesar and drive the occupiers into the sea. Every footstep on the limestone streets echoes with the expectation of violence. It is a stage set for a revolt, and for someone like Judas, the timing was not just significant, it was a catalyst. Now, we tend to sanitize the disciples, don't we? We picture them as these ethereal figures. But Judas Iscariot was a man who handled the logistics. He was the treasurer. When you strip away the legend, you realize he was the one balancing the books, managing the bribes to bypass local tax collectors, and haggling with merchants for stale bread and dried fish. This was not a side task. This was the reality of their survival in an economy designed to drain them dry. And here's the thing about those coins. They weren't what they seemed. Consider the math for a second. A peasant laborer in Galilee earned 1 denarius for a full day of backbreaking work. That coin wasn't just currency, it was a shackle. Half of it was often stripped away by the tributum soli and the tributum capitis, the land and poll taxes, before the man even received it. Every denarius was a testament to the grinding difficulty of their existence. This granular daily work mattered. It built in Judas a specific kind of confidence, a belief that he could manage the movement's survival. He wasn't just a follower, he was the operator. This responsibility fed a quiet, dangerous ego. He thought he knew how to navigate the system, how to use the purse strings to leverage their path. He was managing a movement, and he assumed he knew where the profit margins were hidden. But the coins in his hand were not what they seemed. Judas was likely a man of the Zealot persuasion, or at least deeply sympathetic to their cause, a faction that believed in the active, violent overthrow of Roman authority. They were the ones who carried hidden daggers, the ones who viewed passivity as a spiritual failure. This is where the friction ignited. The Zealots didn't talk about the salvation of the soul. They talked about the liberation of the land from the Roman boot. They were obsessed with the restoration of the Davidic throne. They were waiting for a lion. Instead, they had Jesus. Judas watched the teacher dismantle the power structures of the Pharisees and the temple elites, but he watched with growing volcanic frustration. He saw the teacher walk through the crowds, turn away the seekers of political power, and refuse to arm his followers. Judas lived by a code of the sword. He saw the Roman occupation not as an abstract struggle, but as a daily, choking reality. When Jesus spoke of a kingdom not of this world, Judas heard a metaphor he refused to accept. He wanted a man on a white horse, a king who would kick down the gates of Jerusalem and send the Roman legions running. Instead, he got a man who rode into town on a donkey and insisted that his followers pay their taxes. Judas was trapped in a logical contradiction. How could the Savior of Israel be so unwilling to conquer? His betrayal was a strategic choice. He assumed that if he backed Jesus into a corner, if he forced the confrontation, the man would have to show his power. He assumed the teacher would have no choice but to call down the legions of heaven or lead an armed uprising. He was forcing the issue. He was, in his own mind, the only adult in the room who dared to act. He thought he was doing the right thing for the cause of his people, and that is the tragedy of control. We are all prone to the same fatal error, mistaking our desire for the truth itself. The torches appear in Gethsemane, swaying and dipping, revealing the polished armor of the temple guards behind him. The rustle of olive branches sounds like a landslide in the quiet. He walks up to Jesus. He kisses him. It is an act of forced intimacy intended to identify the target. But look at the tension in his jaw. He expected that by placing Jesus in the grip of the authorities, he would force a reaction. He expected a divine defense. He expected the revolution to start right then. Instead, the teacher simply submitted. The soldiers moved in, and the grand plan collapsed in silence. Judas is the mirror held up to every person who has ever tried to dictate the terms of their own reality. He stood there watching his strategy disintegrate in real time, holding the silver that was supposed to be the price of victory, but was actually the down payment on his own ruin. When the outcome of our life refuses to match our vision, do we have the courage to admit our mistake? Or do we double down on our own failures until the silver loses its luster and we are left with nothing but the silence of the garden? If the most infamous betrayal in history was a requirement encoded into the cosmic architecture long before the perpetrator was even born, can we actually call it a betrayal? Or is it simply an execution of a command? We often default to the Sunday school version of Judas Iscariot, the static villain, the greedy disciple who traded a life for 30 pieces of silver. But that is a moral judgment, not an investigation. If we strip away the centuries of sermons and look at the forensic data of that night, we are not looking at a crime of passion. We are looking at a collision between absolute divine knowledge and human agency. We are analyzing the friction between a script written in stone and a man forced to perform it. If an entity exists outside the constraints of time, seeing the end from the beginning, then Judas pressing his lips to Jesus' cheek wasn't a probability. It was a fixed data point. Now, let's set the scene. Imagine a cramped, rented upper room in Jerusalem. It's not a casual dining hall. It is a triclinium, a U-shaped arrangement of low, wooden benches where guests lie on their left sides, propped up by their elbows, feet pointed away from the table. The air is stifling, a mixture of stale lamp oil, charred grain, and the body heat of 13 men pressed way too close together. The room has a specific hollow acoustic. Every shift of fabric against stone, every rhythmic scrape of a clay bowl is amplified. A single oil lamp creates jumping, erratic shadows that make the walls feel like they are closing in on them. They are breaking bread, but nobody is eating with intention. The silence is artificial. It's the kind of tension that happens right before a pressurized container ruptures. Everyone is waiting for a trigger, and the only person in the room who does not seem to be waiting is Judas. He is physically anchored to the table. He is not sweating. He is not trembling. He is performing the role of the disciple with such practiced, rhythmic precision that it is almost mechanical. He reaches for the bowl. He leans in to listen to Jesus. He is, by all outward appearances, a participant in the brotherhood, but he is a ghost in the machine of that dinner. When Jesus finally breaks the bread, he doesn't speak in metaphors about sacrifice. He pivots, directly and without preamble, to the betrayal. He identifies the traitor, not as a future possibility, but as a current, present tense fact. This is the moment the atmosphere shifts from a shared meal to a crime scene. But here is the paradox that should keep us awake at night. If Jesus knew, could Judas have done otherwise? We have to examine the mechanism of his choice. He had already spoken to the priests. He had already secured the transaction. 30 pieces of silver. Normal volume. And honestly, in the historical context of the first century, this was not just a random amount. It was the specific price listed in the book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 32, the exact compensation paid to a master whose slave has been gored to death by an ox. It was a slave's price, a legal valuation of a life held in contempt. Judas traded a man for the price of a slave. He held the promise of that silver in his mind, yet he returned to the room. He endured the intimacy of the meal. He did not flee, and he did not confess. He played the part of the friend until the exact second the script required him to stop. This is psychological endurance on a staggering scale. The core of the paradox is inescapable. If the event is locked in before the foundation of the world, then the moment of betrayal is not a choice. It is a programmed output. However, if we argue that he did have total freedom to change his mind, to stand up, knock over the table, and walk out, then we must confront the terrifying possibility that Jesus' omniscience could have been wrong. If the future is uncertain, the narrative becomes fragile. If the future is set, we are all just observers of our own lives. To resolve this, theology offers 3 primary frameworks, but we should also consider a fourth, the bridge of compatibilism. First, there is the deterministic model, often associated with strict Calvinist thought. In this view, divine sovereignty is absolute. Everything that occurs is a component of a grand ordained plan. Judas was not a man who went off script. He was the script. In this model, human freedom is an illusion, a feeling we have, like a passenger on a train who thinks they are driving it because they are sitting in the front car. Second, we have the simple foreknowledge model. Think of this like God viewing time not as a sequence, but as a vast landscape. He is standing on a mountain peak, observing a map. He sees the betrayal, but he does not cause it. Judas chooses, and God simply watches the playback. It preserves God's knowledge without violating human agency. But it leaves a lingering, difficult question. If God sees the future, and that future is fixed, how can that choice ever be anything other than what he sees? The third option, middle knowledge or Molinism, is the most complex and perhaps the most unsettling. It suggests God knows every possible path every human could take, the counterfactuals. In this scenario, God knows that in this exact world, with this exact configuration of events, Judas would freely choose to betray him. God did not force the hand, but he built the world where the hand would inevitably move in that direction. This brings us to the fourth perspective, compatibilism. This is the attempt to reconcile the two. It argues that Judas was free because he acted according to his own internal desires, even if those desires were part of a chain of causality that he could not escape. He wanted the silver. He wanted the outcome. He was the author of his desire, even if he was not the author of the system in which he desired it. And that is what I find most unsettling. The pawn narrative is actually more disturbing than the traitor narrative. A traitor is a villain who made a choice we can judge. They have moral agency. A pawn is a function, a biological inevitability. If we accept that the most famous betrayal in history was a predetermined sequence, we lose the moral stakes. The story stops being about human failure and starts being about a cold, calculated output. We are left with the cold, hard objects, the 30 pieces of silver, the bread shared at the table, and the weight of the kiss that signaled the end. We are looking at a man who walked into a room, sat down, and fulfilled a role assigned to him before he was born. If his actions were the only ones that could have happened, then where does that leave our own capacity for choice? Are we the authors of our own paths, or are we simply following a script that was finalized long before we arrived? We are forced to look at the table, the silver, and the kiss, and ask if the outcome was ever actually in question. We want to believe in our own autonomy. We want to believe that when we face a crossroad, the path we take is ours alone. But sitting in that upper room, watching the shadows dance on the wall, the evidence suggests something much more rigid. We are left with the lingering suspicion that some events are not choices at all. They are requirements of the architecture. If we look at the trajectory of our own lives, our own betrayal of our values, our own missed opportunities, our own moments where we stayed when we should have left, are those moments truly our own? Or were they always going to happen exactly as they did? The silence at the end of the story is the only honest answer. The mystery of the upper room remains because it cannot be solved with the tools of logic. We have the 30 pieces of silver, but we do not have the answer. We have the bread, but we do not have the full truth. Perhaps the most uncomfortable realization is not that Judas was a pawn, but that he was a man who lived exactly as he was designed to live. And if that is true for him, is it any less true for us?